the Hindmarsh project, which is the quantitative one, and the Hindmarsh oral history project, were both funded by ERDC, which as of yesterday seems to be now defunct, and so I'm not quite sure where this research is going to go from now. Wanted to say something about how this paper will develop. I'm going to start with a few brief case studies we've taken from the oral history project. Then I want to talk a little bit about the transition from school to work around about the turn of the century, based on those oral history projects. And from there I want to then burrow a little bit more deeply, using the quantitative work, into the experience of schooling at the turn of the century in Hindmarsh. And finally I want to then broaden it out to talk about the relationship between school and work and end up in the 1980s. Because there are some remarkable parallels, it would seem to me, between the period that I'm looking at and the period that we happen to be in at the moment. But first, let me start with the case studies. Evelyn G. was born in February 1886, the third child in a family of 7. And her family wasn't exactly a common one in Hindmarsh, because her mother's family was noted for a long involvement in education in South Australia, and Evelyn was actually born in the house attached to the Bowden School, which was established by her grandparents in the 1850s. Her father, a Scotsman and a noted singer, owned a tanning and currying business on Chief Street in Bowden. The family was comfortably off. They always employed servants, and they ate well, a joint a day, she told me. And from the time she was 4, they lived in 2 houses converted into one in Coghlan Street, Brompton Park. And apart from a year spent at Grange on account of her father's illness, when Evelyn was roughly about 8, they remained in Brompton Park until after her father's death in 1896, moving to North Adelaide in 1898, just before Evelyn turned 13. Evelyn's early years were saturated with music and with education. She spent her early years in the schoolhouse at Bowden, as I've said, attended a private school in the Carrandown Baptist Church after they'd moved to Coghlan Street, and eventually entered the Hindmarsh School in 1892 at the age of 6 years. Now, given her background, it's not surprising that she only spent 2 weeks in the infant department before they promoted her to the first class, and as she, and I quote her, never had any trouble with examinations. She progressed very rapidly indeed. In fact, if her schooling hadn't been interrupted by the year spent down at the Grange, she would have gained her compulsory certificate, which one could get at the end of class 4. She would have gained it at the extraordinarily young age of 9 years and 4 months. As it was, although she missed a lot of days through sickness, particularly through bronchitis, she left the Hindmarsh School at the end of 1898 while she was still in the combined grade 6 and 7, and if it had not been for the death of her father, she would almost certainly have followed her elder sister to the advanced school for girls. Her father, who had observed her progress with some considerable pride, had thought that she ought to go on to be a lawyer, which is quite a remarkable comment on her father at this point in time. But as it was, her school career ended when she left Hindmarsh, and as she wasn't keen to start at the North Adelaide School, being rather shy and not knowing anyone there, and in the relatively straitened circumstances in which they lived, she ended up being apprenticed as a dressmaker in a shop in Gay's Arcade, the position that she took being arranged by her mother, who knew one of the dressmakers at that shop. And apart from a brief spell as a sweet wrapper, a wrapper of caramels, in fact, in O'Connell Street, after she had poisoned her finger while she was apprenticed as a dressmaker, she remained in dressmaking, either at home or at work, until she married, which was the day before she turned 26. And she lived at home right throughout that period, until she got married. Second case of Florence W., who was born in Gawler in 1899, and after spending some time in Port Adelaide, came to live in Croydon when she was 2 years of age. She was the eldest girl in a family of 6. Her father, an English sailor, jumped ship and subsequently worked as a ganger on the railways, and then came to Croydon to operate the railway gate at the crossing there. Her mother, who had never been to school, worked as a midwife in the Hindmarsh area, a craft for which she had no formal training at all, but she worked in this way in order to make ends meet, and Florence, the eldest daughter, stayed home often to cook and wash while her mother was out tending the newborn children. Florence started at the Hindmarsh School at the age of 6, walking to and from school from Croydon every day, and indeed twice a day because she went home for her midday dinner. And she stayed at school until she was 12 and got out of it as soon as she could. She hated school, she said, and was absent a lot as she had to help out at home, especially on Mondays, which were of course washing days. She didn't reach the compulsory standard, which one was supposed to reach if you were going to leave school before 13, and was always in trouble, and as she remarked, she got the cane many times while she was in the school. After she left, she got her first job doing housework, travelling to her employers in time to get breakfast at 7 and arriving home between 6 and 7 at night. Between the years 12 to 18, she had numerous charing jobs of a similar description, getting most of them by word of mouth around the Hindmarsh area, with people coming up to her or to her family and asking if she would come and work for them. When she was 18, she left home to work as a cook on a sheep station and had a number of jobs as a cook in country hotels and in boarding houses. Indeed, she remained away from home until she was 26, when she returned to Adelaide to work in a factory. And the reason she gave for this was in order to learn how to use a sewing machine, because she was about to get married and she wanted to know how to sew. And she, in fact, got married at the age of 28. John C. was born fourth in a family of 6 in Bowden in 1895. His father was a skilled tradesman, a French polisher, and his mother, like most skilled workers' wives in those days, didn't work but kept the house. He attended a quote, baby school run by Mrs. Elton, and then, although a Catholic, went on to the Hindmarsh public school. He left when he reached the leaving age of 13 and was at that stage at the 5th class standard. And while at school, he used to walk from his house on 2nd Street, Bowden that is, to 10th Street to pick up a cow and to take it to the parklands in the morning and retrieve it at night. And for this particular exercise, he got a can of milk given to him every day, and his mother was particularly glad of this. He left school, as he said, as soon as possible, as he wanted to go to work, because as long as you had work, you were all right. His mother, in fact, had made him put his name down at the Labour Bureau in Flinders Street before he left school, as she was anxious to get her son into the railways at Islington. And he himself was also keen to work there, as that was, and I quote him, that was what you would call a permanent job, and once you got into the railways, you were all right. In fact, after passing the medical with a little bit of difficulty, he got his first job at Islington, working there as a rivet boy from when he was 13 and just after he had left the school. And in the time that he spent there, he worked in a variety of shops at Islington, including the paint shop and the blacksmiths. Fortunately for him, and unlike his older brother, who also worked at Islington, he was not put off at the beginning of the First World War to encourage him to enlist in the forces, but rather he stayed there until he was 1926, when he finally left because of his football connections, and he became a hotel keeper. He married when he was 24 years of age while he was still at Islington, and after a courtship that lasted some 8 years. Now, the final one I want to give is Clary O, who was born in 1901 in Brompton. He was what he called a quote, half-caste, his father a Moulder being Catholic and his mother an English Methodist. The family, which moved to West Hindmarsh when he was 8, had its fair share of tragedy. His older sister died of tetanus at age 5, and another child died at birth, and he had 2 younger brothers. Clary, whose nickname was Ned Kelly, had a rather checkered school career. He first attended the Catholic Sisters' School in Brompton when he was 5, and then transferred to a boys' school run by the brothers at Ovingham on the Torrens Road on the hill. And after moving to Hindmarsh, he attended a Catholic school in Theberton for a couple of years, and then he attended the Hindmarsh Public School, the quote, the only Protestant school I attended, between age 11 and 12. And after having the misfortune of knocking his grandfather flying on the Port Road when he was running around during recess time, his grandfather decided that he needed something more discipline, and so he was sent back to the brothers' school at Ovingham when he was in the 4th class at Hindmarsh. And after he considered that he got unjustly caned, he delivered an ultimatum to his mother, and I quote again, either to go back to Hindmarsh or to go to work. And his mother allowed him to go to work, and so he left school at age 12. He didn't envy those who went on to the high school at all, because he very much wanted to do manual work. His early work years were very unstable indeed, a pattern, might I say, very similar to many of the others that we interviewed in the course of this project. He had something like 20 jobs in his first year. His first one was laying out wool for wool sorters during the season, and then after that he moved on to kitchens in Theberton, winding candle wicks, Then he left there to work with a carpenter in Welland, and so on in the course of that first year. He got most of those jobs by word of mouth, or in fact just by going up to the firm and asking if they had any jobs. And as he said, usually the jobs were very easy to get. At age 16, he went to Hallett's and worked in the brickyard, and later moved up to help the engineer, and finally to go on and work in the blacksmith shop, using what he described as his natural flair for tools. And finally, at 21, he became a plumber, a trade he remained in for the rest of his life, although he didn't do a formal apprenticeship in it at all. In his adult years, he looked after his invalid mother, after his father, who by this stage had left moulding to become a bookmaker, had left the house, and he finally married at the age of 36. Okay. Well, there are a number of very striking features about these 4 case studies, which are reiterated in the course of the other ones that we have done. For example, there's the importance of small private schools in the Hindmarsh area in the early education of children from widely different backgrounds. Again, the transient nature of the school experience. As the parents moved around, children attended a variety of schools. Third, the negative experience of school for many, that is, that the failure to gain the compulsory certificate before leaving, was a very common thing indeed. Fourth, the importance of domestic duties and casual jobs for children while they were still at home and indeed in school. Fifth, the tendency to leave school as soon as it was legally possible, or even before, as many of them left at age 12, even though they were not supposed to leave until 13, and particularly to leave school in order to contribute to the family income. Sixth, the lack of any relationship between school and the subsequent work that the children took up. Even the very bright Evelyn, as you recall, her ambitions were thwarted by the death of her father. Again, the importance of informal networks and casual contacts to successful job hunting in the period. Again, the casual nature of work experience for a number of years after leaving, and the lack of formal apprenticeship, coupled with the belief that you learned what you wanted to know while you were on the job rather than in school. And the last two, the tendency to live at home until marriage if one remained in the Hindmarsh area, and finally the relatively late age of marriage, which seems to, insofar as we have been able to establish it, to be fairly common. The point is that these children, who were part of the first generation of compulsory school goers, were living through a transitional phase in the history of childhood in South Australia. All of them attended school for a number of years, particularly those between 6 and 12, albeit, as I shall point out later, often very irregularly, but none of them experienced the stage of extended dependency in their teenage years, which we would now associate with adolescence. Each of them, at age 12 or before, indeed in some cases, assumed some responsibility for the maintenance of the family economy. That is, each of them contributed to the income that the family brought in. Very simply, the tightening of the boundaries between childhood and adolescence and between school and work had yet to occur at this point in time. Children at a very young age assumed adult roles when necessary, and the distinction between particular stages of childhood, which we associate with today, were very blurred indeed. Particularly, and this is the important point, is the nexus between school and work had yet to be forged with any precision for the vast majority of the population at this time. Most of the 50 people we interviewed in the Hindmarsh Oral History Project saw little direct connection between the schooling and their subsequent employment, and virtually all of them were emphatic that their schooling had little influence on the sort of work that they obtained afterwards. As one said, most school leavers in Hindmarsh took up manual... I'm not quoting. As one said, that, pointing out that most school leavers in Hindmarsh took up manual work afterwards, and employers were very little concerned with educational background, and I quote, "It didn't seem to be important in those days. Education in later years did become important, but in those days no one worried about it. As long as you were good at manual work, that was all that was necessary." Of course, the most important factors which governed the transition from school to work in Hindmarsh in the period were the importance of family connections and the ready availability of low-paying casual jobs for teenagers. Most children left school as soon as they were able, and only those whose class background provided security of income even contemplated further education. The rest of them preferred, indeed were very proud of the fact that they were going on to manual work. Some, like John C., entered straight into permanent employment, as the security of income associated with working at the Islington factory was very highly prized in Hindmarsh in this period indeed. Most, however, had a succession of jobs. A succession of jobs that they found often on their own initiative. These jobs were often seasonal, almost invariably lowly paid, and almost never involved formal indenture in apprenticeship. What is striking about the teenage work experience, apart from the large number of jobs that the children had, was the remarkably independent attitude to the jobs that they showed, and their unwillingness to put up with harsh or unfair conditions in their place of employment. Florence B., for example, who, as you recall, had her first country job as a cook on a sheep station, while she was there became so outraged at the rations, or the meagre rations that were given to the paid staff, that she decided to take action. And what she did was an absolutely remarkable thing. They were serving, I presume it must have been T-bone steaks one night, at least, they were supposed to be, and what she decided was that the paid staff would get the steak, and the employers, the people who owned the sheep station, would get the bones on this particular occasion, and so they carved them up, and she put the bones under a silver platter, and they were taken in, and they ate the steak. And when, of course, the mistress of the house came out to complain about this, she just said that we have decided to eat the steak this night because we're sick of eating the scraps. And she was able to do this, and this is the important point, because she knew that they would have a great degree of difficulty in finding another cook. And so she felt reasonably secure in her action. Similarly, Clario walked off a number of jobs because of work conditions, or because he felt put upon by the older men on the job who were bullying him. And another, who I haven't mentioned, Les P., did exactly the same. And in fact once told the owner of a tannery that he was working at that he could do the job himself, or finish the job himself, when the owner tried to get him to lift more than one hide at a time because he was working too slow. Most certainly, and this is the point, their independence was a product of their knowledge that jobs were easily obtained, but allowed them to leave one job for another if the conditions were better, or the pay better, or the work more interesting, or even if they just wanted to learn another skill. As Les P. said, a boy can always get a job at the glassworks if he's really desperate, because I gather there was a standing advertisement for boys to work in the glassworks in the newspapers of the day. Well, this independence of mind in those casual work situations contrasted almost certainly with their experience at school. In the course of the interviews, we got the impression that most of them actually just endured their school years without ever seeing much sense to it at all. In fact, the experience was often extremely negative, as the discussion of the preliminary research findings from the Hindmarsh project will reveal. Now, I need to say something about the Hindmarsh project in order to put this into context. So those of you who have heard this will have to bear with me for a moment. The project was basically set up to explore the relationship between class and gender and schooling in the 25 years following the development, or at least the passing, of the Compulsory Attendance Act in 1875. It's based on school registers for Hindmarsh, which are located in the archives, and it uses all of those records in order to build up a comprehensive portrait of everyone who attended the Hindmarsh school. The admission registers for Hindmarsh, as indeed for any school in this period, recorded the information such as the name, age, sex, parents, occupation, address, school, career, the regularity of attendance, the date of leaving, plus some comment usually on where they may have gone. And all in all, in the period between 1878, when the Hindmarsh School was established, and 1899, which is when we arbitrarily decided to finish it, some 8,600 students were enrolled in either the infant school, the boys' school, or the girls' school. And those 8,600 entries form the basis of the computer-assisted research that is going on at the moment. They were, risk of boring you, the records were coded into a machine-readable form and then were subsequently put onto the computer so that we could analyse the relationship between occupation, sex, schooling, and so on. And in fact, there is one person here who indeed had a good deal to do with that work. At this stage of the analysis, I just want to highlight 4 outstanding features of late 19th century schooling in Hindmarsh. The first one, as I've already alluded to, was the widespread use of small private schools long after the 1875 Education Act was passed. Indeed, in its early years, the Hindmarsh School, which was built to accommodate 1,000 people, had great difficulty in filling its classrooms. And those small, quote, quote, inefficient private schools, usually run by women, absolutely abounded and continued to remain very important until well into the 1890s. There were literally scores of them in the Hindmarsh area, and they catered especially for young children and also for girls in particular. The 1891 census, for example, indicates that something like 1/3 of the girls between the ages of 7 and 12 were in private schools, compared to only 18% of the boys. And of those who were admitted to Hindmarsh in the period 1884 to 1899, some 25 to 30% of them came from private schools or had their first experience in private schools, compared to only about 15 to 20% of the boys. That is, as well as a larger proportion of girls never attending the public schools, more of them spent their early years in private schools indeed. And the fact that these small schools were closely linked to the local neighbourhood and provided considerable flexibility in attendance requirements almost certainly explains the reasons why the parents sent their daughters to them rather than to the Hindmarsh School itself. And I will come back to that point in a moment. The second feature that comes out of the analysis is that the school population was an extraordinarily transient one. By that I mean one that moved around an enormous amount. About 40% of the boys admitted to the school transferred from other state schools, either in Adelaide or somewhere else in South Australia, compared to about 30% of the girls. And the differential between the two reflected, of course, the greater likelihood that girls would have attended private schools in their early days. But the transient nature of the population is also demonstrated by the age of leaving, because an enormous number of these students left that school before the age of 11, and usually, might I say, without any indication as to where they might have gone. The point is that as the parents moved from house to house, from suburb to suburb, from region to region, that movement was a very common thing indeed in the 19th century or the late 19th century, and the children moved and sometimes were enrolled in other schools and sometimes weren't. We're at present trying to trace these kids from the Hindmarsh School through Theberton and through Brompton, which started in 1886 and obviously drew a large number of its children from the Hindmarsh School. But it's a very difficult task indeed. But certainly that transience, that movement of people, was remarkably high. The third very important point about the children's experience of the schools was that the incidence of failure at the annual examinations, which are held in June in the Hindmarsh case, was extraordinarily high. The common experience of students was to repeat at least one grade, and the yearly promotion through the classes was very rare indeed. In the period 1884 to 1891, for example, only 40% of the sons of the entrepreneurs and 33% of the sons of skilled workers or tradesmen and 21% of the sons of casual labourers who attended the school for 3 or more years, only those small proportions were promoted every year that they were in the school. And the figures for their sisters were remarkably similar, something like 45%, 34% and 14%. The importance of this very high rate of failure was twofold. First of all, very few students under the age of 13 reached the compulsory standard, that is, the standard at the end of class 4, which meant that you could leave school before age 13. Something like less than 7% of both boys and girls under the age of 13, of those who were enrolled between 1884 and 1891, and only 10% of the boys and 12% of the girls between 1892 and 1899 reached the compulsory standard before they reached the leaving age. And importantly, even those who stayed on beyond the compulsory age were very unlikely to reach that compulsory standard then. Something like 17% of the boys and 12% of the girls between 1884 and 1891, and it increased quite dramatically in the second decade to between 31% of the boys and 41% of the girls between 1892 and 1899. The second important point about that failure rate was that the age ranges in the junior classes was extremely wide indeed, especially for children of skilled workers and labourers whose success rates were lower. For example, in 1884, even though the average age in grade 1 was 8, the sons and daughters of skilled workers ranged in age from 5 to 11, and the sons and daughters of labourers from 5 to 12. Moreover, in 1899, which is the last date that we are looking at, 4 and 5-year-old age ranges remained relatively common within the one class. That is, the individual classes in the Hindmarsh school, in the period that I'm looking at, must have resembled those one-room schoolhouses of the small private schools in the area, and also the one-room rural schoolhouses, which were decreed as inefficient and wasteful by those who established that school system. A very broad age range indeed, and something that I might say that in other evidence we have very little indication of. The fourth very striking feature about schooling in this period was that irregularity of attendance was exceptionally high. The most striking aspect of figures on attendance in the period is not that they varied seasonally, although of course they did, with attendance being much higher in the middle 2 quarters of the year, but rather that large numbers of children from all occupational backgrounds attended for less than the 35 compulsory days that one was supposed to attend each quarter. For example, in the second quarter of 1884, at the end of which the annual examination was held, and therefore one can reasonably assume that if one was going to attend, that would be the quarter that you would try to attend, about 25% of the boys and 1/3 of the girls attended for less than the required number of days, for less than 35 days out of a possible 55 to 60 days. And even in 1899, in the same quarter, over 20% of the boys and girls and manual workers were in school for less than that 35 days. The relative ubiquity of irregular attendance among children from all occupational backgrounds, in conjunction with the use of private schools and transients, is indicative, I think, of the complex relationship that one faces when one tries to analyse the relationship between the parents and their children and the new school system that had been established in 1875. It indicates, as the oral histories had suggested in those cases that I gave before, that many masters and small manufacturers and shopkeepers, as well as the skilled workers and labourers, were dependent to some extent on the labour of their children during their school years. The irregular attendance patterns also serve to remind us of the relative unimportance of schooling in the minds of the parents of this first generation of compulsory school students. Obviously, schooling, just by looking at the irregularity of attendance figures, remained very much a part-time activity, and the child's life was not marked by any clear and abrupt transition from school to work. At this point, I should say that one of the most interesting things about the oral history, and a warning, I believe, to anyone who's involved in oral history, is that in the course of all the 50 interviews, we rarely turned up anyone who would say that they didn't attend school regularly while they were actually there. People would say, oh no, I was at school every day. And yet, if I was, with the computer analysis, if I had wanted to do this, I could have indeed printed out the list of their attendance on any particular day or any particular quarter and said, well, you're only in school for 15 days in that particular quarter. Of course, we didn't do that, but nonetheless, there was a great discrepancy between the memories of the people about their regularity of attendance and the actual patterns of attendance as recorded in the records. And we're not entirely sure why this might be the case, though one suspects that in thinking back to your education, or to these people's education, which was a very significant factor in their lives in one sense, they've tended to romanticize it a bit. Well, what do we make of all these patterns that I've just been describing? And at this stage, I might say we make very tentative conclusions indeed. Essentially, though, I think the important thing is to remember that the use of schooling made by the Hindmarsh parents in this period must be understood in a particular context, which has 3 basic factors to it. The relationship between the demands of the labour market that they were actually involved in, that is their seasonal and rhythmical work patterns of the parents, the division of labour within the family, the necessity of children of either sexes doing casual work at particular points or indeed doing housework throughout the week, and the continually asserted and very strong belief in the right of the parent to control the use of the child's time. Not surprisingly, in the period that I'm looking at, when prolonged schooling was only of very tangential relevance indeed to future job prospects, of children of both sexes, the battle for family survival took precedence. That is, that children of particular ages and particular sexes that parents made decisions about children of particular ages and sexes about how long they would send them to school, and they only sent them to school when they were not required to work or help around the house. Importantly, though, and this is the point that I want to draw towards a conclusion on, the demands of child labour, which I've just alluded to, within the family economy, could be accommodated within a state school system which required only a minimum number of days attendance. That is, the 35 days a quarter that was required by the South Australian Act from 1878, and which in 1905 was changed in urban areas to 4 out of every 5 days, and then in 1915 it was made every day of the week unless one had a medical excuse or another one. With that minimum attendance requirement, children could continue to work and still satisfy the compulsory requirement for attendance. And this has indeed been argued by the social historian Kerry Wimshurst, who has said that there was such a category of people living in Hindmarsh and indeed in rural areas who would count up their 35 days and go to school for those, then leave the school and then work for a considerable amount of time and then do another 35 days at the end of the second quarter, and so get a block of something like 3 months in the middle where they needn't be in school, providing, of course, that sickness didn't intervene to upset the calculations. The point is, though, that the flexibility inherent in that minimum attendance requirement, which still acknowledged the parent's right to control, at least partially, the child's time, was destroyed by the imposition of that dependency model of childhood in 1915. The insistence on full-time attendance from that period, and as well as the tightening of the nexus between school and work in the 20th century, made it very much more difficult to satisfy the demands of both the family and the school. The effect on children's lives in areas such as Hindmarsh of these developments was particularly was considerable, as they made, in the first instance, the boundaries between full-time school and work much more marked, at the same time as they lengthened the school-aged child's day. And they lengthened the school-aged child's day quite considerably because the work and family responsibilities had to be squeezed into the hours before and after school. If you remember John C., for example, taking the cow before and picking the cow up after, it made a considerable difference to the amount of time that he had to himself. Those two things in the 20th century meant that the form of childhood that we have come to know ourselves, and also particularly the form of adolescence, or what we understand by adolescence, began to take shape in roughly this period that I've been talking about. I suspect I have been talking for rather too long, so I want to conclude, but as I said at the outset, I wanted to make a couple of comments about the present day. The first one is, what, as far as I can see, can only be seen as a deliberate policy, particularly in places like supermarket chains, department stores, and fast food outlets. The casualisation of the labour force has been increasing in the past few years. There is a trend towards the employment of school-aged adolescents, and I believe at the moment something over 40% of metropolitan high school teenagers now hold part-time jobs. These jobs, like their turn-of-the-century counterparts, are usually dead-end and disappear when the teenager reaches 18 and adult wages have to be paid. In essence, the crisis of youth that we are presently witnessing is fundamentally a crisis of permanent jobs for adolescents over the age of 18, and the succession of part-time casual jobs now held by 16 to 20-year-olds bears some resemblance to the succession of jobs held by the school leavers between the ages of 12 and 15 or 16 in 1900. The second point is that the era of the close relationship between schooling and work appears to have been a relatively short-lived one indeed. As I say, first forged this century, it now seems to be almost over. What will happen to the dependency model of childhood and adolescence is a very interesting question. Clearly, the transition from school to work is becoming increasingly blurred again, as many children hold jobs while still in school, but cannot find permanent jobs because they're not being generated, the permanent jobs at least, are not being generated in the economy. Just how this crisis will be solved is not clear, although it seems most likely that those in power will opt for a further extension of the years of institutionalised dependency to keep teenagers off the labour market artificially. one continually hears that remedies such as the lifting of the compulsory leaving age, the establishment of transition education programs, or the imposition of national service are the answers to the crisis that we now face. What I want to suggest at the end is that what we're witnessing is another crisis of youth, very similar in many ways to the one at the turn of the century that I've been talking about, and that one, of course, gave rise to the compulsory full-time schooling in 1915, and also to vocational training, and particularly, of course, to technical education programs. The 1980s answers, it seems to me, are depressingly similar in their assumptions and also in their implications.
Well, I'm sure that speech has engendered lots of questions in your mind, and Ian said he's quite happy to answer questions.
Quite happy to try and answer.
He's quite happy to try and answer questions.
People who remembered not valuing their education, their schooling, did they speak of reading newspapers regularly?
Even Evelyn G., the first case that I gave John, who obviously had a remarkable career, said that, and when we asked specifically about that, said that she virtually read not at all after she left school because she was so busy sewing at night, making clothes for the family and so forth, that she just stopped reading. And we found very little evidence of people reading a lot. The ones who didn't value schooling, almost certainly, insofar as I can recall, didn't read newspapers very much. Although I think they were aware, through oral discussions at the workplace, of issues that were going on at the time, almost certainly. Yes, obviously there were attempts. By further education, you mean as we would know it today?
Yeah, after.
Well, the WA is an obvious example of that, University Extension, and also the WA, which was established in 1913, I think, or got going at that particular point in South Australia. Of course, there were through the institutes, through some of the trade unions, and I'm sure through a whole variety of other areas, even I think through the education department. But there was nothing outside, and I can stand corrected on this, but outside of the WA, I don't think that there was a formal attempt at that point. But I can stand correct.
Yes.
Have you come across any evidence of the authorities not enforcing the compulsory clauses in the Hindmarsh area? I think A.G. Austin mentions in his book that after the introduction of the 1872 Education Acts in Victoria, that in certain suburbs of Melbourne, the education authorities discouraged the children from destitute, impoverished families from attending government schools on the grounds that they tarnish the reputation or the image of the school and thereby put off the middle class families from attending their children. Did that same thing occur in Adelaide?
I know what you're referring to. I haven't seen any direct evidence that actually occurred in Hindmarsh. Certainly people didn't make any real attempt to enforce compulsory clauses at this point. That is, they would turn a blind eye to those people who were involved in some genuine activity within the home or some casual labour. But I think the point is that those small schools in Hindmarsh, and Catholic schools as well, of which there were a number, were the ones that picked up the sort of quote dregs of the society that you were referring to. Although the range of occupations within Hindmarsh was remarkable, very remarkable indeed at this point within the Hindmarsh school.
I may have missed something.
No, you haven't missed it. I think you can make a very plausible argument about this, though I wouldn't buy it completely myself, but let me make it any case, that one can almost trace the history of the development of state schooling in terms of perceived crises of children or of youth. Particularly in urban areas, might I say. The problem is not perceived as a rural one at all in that sense. One sees it around about 1875 when there's a considerable amount of concern, as you probably know, in fact I know you know, about urban street children, as they were called. Certainly the same sorts of problems are apparent in the period that 1900 through 1915. And most certainly at the moment, one only has to walk along Rundle Mall any day of the week and see all of those people hanging around, and there's equation of idleness with propensity for crime and getting into trouble, and that in itself leads the Department of Community Welfare, I think, to establish a street office there in order to make certain that it can try and keep these people off the streets. I think that sort of relationship tends to be there, though it's obviously not the only answer. But certainly the 1905 Act, which established 4 out of every 5 days for students in urban areas, was very clearly related to what they could perceive as a problem of juvenile delinquency in urban areas, because it remained 35 days a quarter in the rural areas.
I'm interested in the position of the parents, that apparently they moved about. Now, there must have been accommodation for them. And what percentage owned their own places, or did they move because they were coming down in the scale or going up? And then the effect of that on the children. They changed their schools a lot, but they had no time to sort of dig in.
It's a very important question, and one that I can't give any precise answer to. There is no doubt that ownership of one's own home was a very important factor in residential stability, for obvious reasons, and also, therefore, a very important factor in school attendance of children. But at this stage, I haven't done the linkages to the rate books in order to be able to establish that, but certainly it would be a very important thing, and it is an important thing to do. But the movement, insofar as we can establish it, did often involve the movement to a place where one had bought or attempted to buy a home. It was also people who were keeping one step ahead of the rent collector. There's no doubt about that. It was also people who were literally just moving from one area because their place of work had shifted, and therefore the necessity of moving on. And some of those movements were undoubtedly seasonal and involved movements, far away from Hindmarsh every year and back again. But one of the interesting things, I suppose, about Hindmarsh as an area is that it does retain a fairly intense local flavour in terms of the number of people that we interviewed who had lived virtually all their lives in Hindmarsh was absolutely remarkable. Well, I could tell you, I suppose, quite a lot, but when I said they endured school, when we asked them about what they remembered about school, most of them tended to remember things like the discipline in particular, and the fact that the teachers had been very strict. In fact, many of them made the comment, of course, that today's kids have it very easy in the schools, and that what is needed is more discipline. And most of them also associated particularly discipline with some form of corporal punishment, which obviously was for boys and girls, as Florence B. indicates. But when we questioned them on actually what they had learned, there was not very many precise memories about that at all. There was also a real fear about fairly difficult an experience for people to be when the inspector came around every year to ask you those questions, which would determine your future career. And the interesting thing about that is that most of them have internalised, and this is true, I suppose, of most people, the school's definition of success. That is, when you ask them about failure, they would say that, yes, I wasn't too bright at school work, although I was very good with my hands, and therefore I didn't do too well at school. But accepting that measure of success, which, as you probably know, I would believe is a measure of success that has no absolute meaning outside of the one that was imposed on it at that particular point in time, in terms of what was asked of them.
Claudia, you've done a lot on what they did at school, haven't you? The sort of curriculum they had. That film that you did.
I'd be more interested to ask our speaker a question than speak myself.
Thanks, Claudia. A minute.
I'd like to know, has he done any study of the general health situation in Hindmarsh in this period?
Didn't she ask me this question last week? As I said to you last week, the answer to that is, at this point, well, we haven't done a blow-by-blow, month-by-month analysis of epidemics and so forth. But obviously, yes, that's, as I said again last week, that's a very important point indeed, that epidemics were endemic at this particular point in time, and there's no doubt that irregularity of attendance is, to some extent, is related to that. But also, as I said last week, I still believe that beyond that, there are much deeper causes than just the diseases and the sicknesses, although they are very important. But we haven't, as you know, done it yet.
By a much deeper cause, are you looking for something like a general disbelief in the value of schooling?
No, I'm not looking for... No, I'm not looking for general disbelief in the value of schooling at all. I believe that, one of the interesting things is that most parents, or at least most people that we interviewed, said of their parents that they valued, particularly the mothers, valued education highly particularly because of the security that they seemed think that it might give to their students, their children in future life, that they would have a better life than their own. And I believe that that valuing of education is exceptionally important and was rooted in most of the Hindmarsh kids' own lives. But they certainly didn't associate that sort of education, insofar as we can, with what they actually got while they're in the school, and that's the distinction I would want to make, with a particular form of schooling. Okay, that's the distinction.
There's a question down here. Here, over here. What was the academic standard of the teachers at that time?
Well, not very high in terms of present-day standards, obviously. No, most of the teachers in the Hindmarsh school would have been, and Claudia will probably be able to answer this better than I would think, would have been probably pupil teachers themselves in the first instance. Is that correct, Claudia?
Do you believe about that organised to sort of...
A lot of singing.
Relief, as it were.
A lot of singing and marching, but not organised sport, strangely enough. There appeared to be very little. But obviously, yes, there were quite a number of anecdotes about things that had happened at school that provided life relief. But one of the things that was interesting about the interviews was, again, that when talking about what people did in their spare time, apart from the Theberton and Hindmarsh gang, which most of the boys seem to remember with affection, throwing things at each other across the torrent, there, of course, wasn't very much, really, that they're involved outside of the church, which remained an absolutely essential institution, and most of the social life revolved around the various churches. But in school, no, not very much light relief at all, in terms of organised fun.
I'm thinking of perhaps organised a concert or something.
Oh, yes, there were. Yeah, there were.
Singing and marching concerts. Yes, over here. No, if you... Yes.
Actually, it's not a question, it's a
Statement.
statement that never struck me before, but it was interesting. But my mother went to a small rural Catholic school during that period, and one of the things that she told us all through our childhood, she'd acted in a play every year, and she knew everything about those plays. In fact, she could practically still give you her role.
Peter, yes.
This is a question. You've been trying to put, well, I've gathered things into common categories. Were there many exceptions to all this? Did you have any Rhodes Scholars or university people coming out of Hindmarsh? If so, I imagine they would tell you a lot about what they left behind or reasons why they left it behind. Do you think of that become apparent yet?
There was a Rhodes Scholar, I believe, Hindmarsh. If you, I think I'm right when I say Rhodes Scholar. Certainly, if you get hold of the Hindmarsh Centenary book from the school, which was published in 1978, it has one whole page is devoted to a photograph of one of the top scholars of that period. I'm not sure whether he was Rhodes. Obviously, some people did go on, though I haven't yet come across anyone who went to university amongst the people that I'm dealing with. Though, again, one of the problems for me there is trying to track them onwards, okay? Because once they leave the school, it becomes something of a difficult task for me to find out where they've got to. Interestingly enough, Evelyn G's sister, who went to the advanced school for girls, only was there for 3 months. And then again, because of the father's death, was withdrawn from it and was apprenticed as a dressmaker in Kensington. Her brother, and these were amongst the top scholars in the school, her brother, they had taken out an insurance policy so that he would attend PAC after he left the Hindmarsh school, but again, because of the father's death, that insurance policy was cashed in and he didn't go on to PAC and was apprenticed to become a shoemaker. I at the moment can't give you very many examples of people who did succeed, but obviously there were a number of people who did, but certainly they were the exception, and that's the point that I'd like to stress.
Speak as though you've interviewed these people, but then your study starts back in 1878, and they must have been a few years old before they went to school then.
The oldest was 1886.
When did you start interviewing them?
Well, that's Evelyn G. is the oldest person we interviewed, who still is alive and we've got literally hundreds, well, would be well over 100 pages of interview, typed transcript with her. The method of selecting the people was that I went to the Hindmarsh Centenary celebrations, which were in 1978, okay, and then didn't round up, but made beelines for all of the, obviously very old scholars who turned up for that. And then through domiciliary care, Meals on Wheels in particular, and through the Senior Citizens Club, and through just the word of mouth comments that were made, we tracked down up to enough. We're trying to keep the sex and the age balances and the occupational background of the people in check, that we could make up the 50 interviews that we were doing. We did extend beyond. We originally intended to interview only people who were born before 1900. But we did, in the end, extend it through to people who were born up to 1910. And one of the reasons for doing that was, apart from getting some longitudinal view of what had happened, we also found that many of the people that we interviewed who were born in 1910 had very clear recollections about their parents' families and parents' work indeed, and that was an important check on the memories of the very old people that we were interviewing in the first instance. Sue Marsden, as I said, did the vast bulk of the interviewing, and Ray Brimhill and myself did about 5 or 10 each, I think. But Sue did most of it.
There'd be a certain selection according to durability.
Obviously. Yeah, there is absolutely no doubt. And of course, one of the points that we made was, when we applied for the grant, was that unless we did it now, we would lose contact with anyone who had had any contact with the 19th century, and which we considered to be important in terms of the study. But the other thing, and this is a very important and unfortunate point, is that we found very few labourers among those we interviewed, not only presumably because they may have died earlier, but also because they tended presumably not to remain in Hindmarsh because they didn't buy houses in the area. So we're very short on skilled labourers, unskilled labourers at the bottom of it.
Is it possible for you to give some indications of broad categories of the occupations of the people that you've got most of your information? Not the people, the parents of the people you've got most of your information from.
You want me to give them of the 50 interviewees rather than of the 8,000 people? Well, it's easy for me to do with the large numbers. Basically, Hindmarsh, in terms of how we define skilled worker, which is a skilled trade, was very much an artisan's town corporation, if you like. There were over 40% of those that are his kids who sent their kids to the school fall into that category that I've defined as skilled worker. Now, it's a relatively broad category and needs refining over time. And about 20% were unskilled labourers, okay, and about another 10 to 15% were in transport, and we've separated them out. That's carters and draymen and carriers and so forth, because it's very difficult to locate them as skilled workers or unskilled workers. And a considerable number of commercial clerks and so forth, non-manual workers, I suppose. And of course, I think it's about 7 or 8% who were merchants, manufacturers, and so forth. Okay? That's basically the occupational breakdown. But an overwhelming number of them in the skilled trades, about 40%.
And were the 50 people that you interviewed, were they fairly representative of that distribution?
As I say, we attempted to do that in the choosing of the people, but we did, as I also said, run into that problem of we found nowhere near 20% unskilled labourers in the group. Although, mind you, if you take a person's occupational profile over a long period of time, I mean, what will happen is that they will move in and out of a variety of occupations. So the point that when I use the register, a school register, I'm only capturing them at a particular point in time, unless we subsequently link them. Can I just say something about that too, which is the quantitative analysis is the most difficult part of it in many ways, simply because it's fraught with tremendous problems. That is to do with, because the kids moved in and out of the school a remarkable number of times, one has this problem of having to continually amalgamate the records. That is, you have a record when they first come into the school, and then they go away, and they'll be away for over a year, and then they come back in, and they'll appear again as a new entry. So what we've had to do is go through all of those in an alphabetical list of them and put the same person together in both ones and try and put them together. We're also now trying to do that for those who went to Brompton and Theberton and also to Hindmarsh as well. But it's a very time-consuming process.
Even with the computer, isn't
it? Even with the computer, yes. The computer doesn't really do as much as one would like it to do. I mean, all the computer is a super adder, upper, and subtractor, multiply, and divider, basically. A few more fancy calculations.
Well, yes.
Presumably most of most of them were of Anglo-ethnic origin. Were there any other ethnic groups represented? If so, what were they?
When you say Anglo-ethnic, you mean including Irish as well?
Well, perhaps you can differentiate there too.
Yes, I haven't got the figures with me, but I think about the overwhelming proportion of them were of the parents. About half the parents were born in England. A fairly large number were born in South Australia, quite long residents of South Australia. About 8% were born in Ireland and a similar percentage in Scotland. There were a few Germans, but outside of that, no significant other ethnic groups represented. The overwhelming majority of the children were born in South Australia. Okay. But a very large number of the people we interviewed, parents came out, or grandparents came out in the 1850s and 60s, and they were long-lived residents of Hindmarsh. Very large number.
Is there a question up here?
Ian, would you like to compare your findings in Hindmarsh with those of Ontario?
In a sentence.
Well, in a sentence,
You can have two.
the records that I used in the two studies were entirely different in the first instance, so the comparison is very difficult. That is that in Ontario we used the census records, which is the manuscript form filled out by every person who lived in the city that we looked at every year. And of course we don't have those records in South Australia, or in Australia for that matter. But I did do school register work in roughly the same period in the course of that work in order to get at regularity of attendance, okay, which is the key feature of its schooling as far as I'm concerned. And yes, it was just as irregular in Ontario. Yes, the age range was just as broad in each individual grade as it was in Ontario, even though this school system in Ontario boasted about its age-graded classification right from the 1850s. And yes, the incidence of failure was very high. So in a sense, they were very similar, even though the Ontario city in the 1890s was an iron and steel town of considerable proportion, whereas Hindmarsh is a town that's dominated by small, as you I'm sure know, small manufacturing, particularly tanning works, brickyards, of course, Hallett's being very large, and the gasworks. But outside of those, no very large employers at all. In fact, if you look at the census of factories for Hindmarsh, you find very few kids under the age of 21 indicated as being employed in any of the factories in Hindmarsh, which is, of course, I think a product of the fact that they were employed casually and therefore not recorded on those figures of permanent employment.
Yes, did the strike in the 1890s show any evidence in the school attendance or regularity of school?
It's a very good question. I can't at the moment answer it. We will get, once we've got this data under control, we'll get round to that nitty-gritty type analysis. Yeah, it's a good question, but at the moment I don't know. I expect it would have. It caused breast thumping in the annual reports and the inspectors and so forth. I suspect the blind eye was not necessarily turned by the people at all, but rather it was very difficult to track people down, because if kids were coming and going in the rate that they obviously were, that remarks column in the register where they were supposed to indicate what had happened to them, they literally had no idea as far as I could see, because if the kid moved, it was very difficult to track them indeed. Now, the truant officers obviously became much more effective after 1915, as Phil Cashin's work shown, but in the period that I got, while the boards of advice attempted to track them down, they didn't really enforce it very carefully at all. With a certain degree of sympathy too, I suspect.
Well, I think Ian's been very good with all those questions, and I'm sure that he will answer more over a cup of coffee.